Hello guys, and welcome back to Getting Started with LabVIEW, and in today's example we will look into constructor node. Now constructor node is basically just a way of us calling any assemblies or DLL that is actually built using C# or VB. Basically it's any DLL that is actually built using the .NET framework. Here you can actually find the constructor node in the connectivity palette under .NET. So you can see this is where we can actually call the constructor node. You can actually just put it here, and what happens here is that it will actually search for the particular DLL or the class assemblies, class libraries that you actually want to search for. Now let me show you one example there where I have actually built a class library, a DLL in Visual Studio. First we will actually look into the example library here. So this example library is basically the namespace, and within this namespace, basically the library itself, within this library itself you can actually find a class called LabVIEW.NET example. Whenever we call in whenever we use a constructor node, it is basically just calling a class within the namespace, which is the library itself. So what I did here is, well, first we have to make sure that we are calling the correct class, which is the constructor of the class itself. And I actually separated into two different parts here, where we have the functions that which can be called in property node, and another functions which can be called into invoke node. So the first function here basically just gets in a user string input, and it gives out a string output. In the method here, which is the invoke node version for .NET, I actually created three different functions. First is the return odd and even. Basically it takes in an input of a number in the form of integer and return it into a string, and it will actually tell whether if it's a even or an odd number. The second function here is basically a Pythagoras theorem, where I calculate the hypotenuse using the input of opposite and adjacent. And the third one is actually just returning out a boolean value, where you input a boolean value and you immediately output a boolean value. So once I have already built the DLL, which I actually press here Control B in Visual Studio, it actually has the function here. Most of the time whenever you build a DLL in Visual Studio, you can actually find the location of the DLL within the project itself, which most of the time you can actually find here in this DLL. So we will be calling this particular DLL into our constructor node. Now let's go back to the .NET here. If let's say you haven't choose any constructor node yet, so what you need to do is you can go to select constructor, and this is the example library, which is the namespace that we actually declared earlier. So if you click browse, and it will immediately go into the example library.dll. So let's select OK, and what you can see here, this is the namespace, and this is the class that we're actually trying to access. So once we select this, it will actually select the class as a constructor. So let's click OK, and now you have already created a constructor. So what you need to do is, let's try the property node. Let's access the property node here, where we actually see here we have the user input value, which is the input and output. So once I have select the property node, as you all know that property node can be written or can be read. So this one here, let's try to right click, and you can see this is actually changed all to write. So let's write it and select user input. So it's actually taking a string input, and then I would like to create another property node, and I want to change this to write. Change to read. So let's create an indicator here and put this down here, and the next let's create a control. Let's create a control here. Alright, so now we have actually called in the property node. So what I need to do is, I'm going to type in any value here. This is a test, and then when I select run, it will load the DLL, get the function, and put the output into the string indicator. So right now it should be getting the value here. If you realize that whenever you call a .NET assembly, a .NET DLL, or for the first time, and when you try to run it, it will take some time, because it will actually try to remember where's the location of the DLL. But the next time when you try to run, it becomes faster. It slightly becomes faster. So let's change this again. Second test, it becomes slightly faster. So that's the one of the things that you just need to be aware of whenever you're calling a .NET DLL. Now let's say if I want to call in invoke node, which is the methods that we actually seen just now. So let's just remove this and let's call in the invoke node here. As I actually explained earlier, we actually have 3 different types of invoke nodes. So I'm going to put in 3 here to demonstrate the functions. So I'm going to call the first one, the first invoke node, which is the Boolean button. So you have an input of a Boolean and output of a Boolean. The second one here would be the second function would be to calculate the Pythagoras theorem, which is it gives out the value of the hypotenuse. And the third one here, let's put in the third value, which is the odd and even number, which is this one, return string number. Alright, so let's try the first function here. The first function here actually needs a Boolean input. So let's put in here a toggle switch. Let's put in here a toggle switch, and then let's put in output, which is the square LED. The second one here, let's put a Boolean input here, Boolean. Next one is the Pythagoras theorem. So let's put this here as a value of A, and let's call this value of B, and the hypotenuse would be the indicator, numeric indicator. So let's put here C. So let's put here C in the hypotenuse, be the adjacent. And lastly, I need to put in a number here. So let's put in a number here for this function. Let's put in here user input, and it should actually, because this one is actually taking an integer 32, so let's change the representation to integer 32, and it should give me a return type. Let's create an indicator. So the number type, is it an even or an odd number? So let's try this. Okay, so now we actually have the entire setup. So let's put this into true. So I should get a true value here. For the Boolean value here, let's put here 5. Let's say 5 for opposite. The adjacent is 12, and here, sorry, here I should get 13, and then I want to put the number 2. So we know that 2 is an even number, so it should actually return me an even number. So let's run this, and now you can see that it is actually returning me this particular value. Now to make things interesting, I always like to put it into a while loop so that I can actually see how the values are running while the program is running. So let's try to run this. I can do this on and off, returning the true value here, true and false value, and I also can even change the value, so I can actually get an exact value of Pythagoras theorem. So let's say, for example, if I have a value of 3 and then I reduce this to the value of 4, I should get the output value 5. So this is true, and then for every time I increase the number, I can get odd and even based on the number that is actually being input. So this is one good example that how we can actually create function in C# and then C# or VB.NET, build it into a DLL and use the constructor node to call it in LabVIEW. And for you guys worrying about the formula, not to worry, I'll put the formulas of the class library into the comments below. And thank you for watching.